heavy topic, so thank you in advance for listening. And I do want to acknowledge before I begin that I personally have no Native American heritage, and that's important because the history of Native American boarding schools truly belongs to those communities who were most affected by it, and I cannot stress enough the importance of Native voices in telling the story. My remarks today are from within the limits of my professional experience, and I am deeply indebted to others for sharing their knowledge with me, especially scholars and leaders from Native American communities, survivors, and their descendants. I never assume that anyone I meet is familiar with the role of an archivist. There are many aspects, but I would describe it generally as a cross between a research librarian and a museum curator. I'm responsible for the documents and information created by and about the Archdiocese from its earliest origins and into the unforeseeable future. And my job is to make sure that all of that information is collected, organized, preserved, and made accessible for answering questions that no other sources can answer. And sometimes those questions that need to be answered are very, very difficult. I first set foot in the Archdiocese archives almost exactly 10 years ago, and it was around that time that I first encountered records relating to the American Indian experience in the history of the local Catholic Church, and what I read deeply affected me. The records also raised many questions for me, questions about language and access and audience, and they also gave me a concrete encounter with the intersection of archival work and social responsibility. I'd like to share with you one of the first records that I encountered all those years ago, which remarkably is the earliest record that we've identified to date relating to Native American boarding schools in Minnesota. This document dates from 2 years before the Diocese of St. Paul was even established. It was found among the personal papers of our first bishop. It is a petition from 27 Ho-Chunk chiefs to the U.S. Secretary of War from 1848, objecting to the government school. And for those who don't know, the Indian boarding school program was under the Office of War. The chiefs write that they, as free people, wish to be permitted to build schoolhouses at their own expense and for the present teacher to be removed because the children that have attended that school are, quote, much more immoral than any others of the same tribe. They further protest, quote, we do not wish to be compelled to have our children taught different from what we ourselves believe to be right. Not one has left that school, but that is a disgrace to the tribe. Note that many of our children that went to that school were gems of our hearts, as beautiful as the flowers that deck our wide prairies, but when returned to us, were loathsome with diseases contracted while at that school. I get quite emotional every time I read this record, and the rest of it is even just as powerful as that. And it has stuck with me as one of the most poignant in our care. Regrettably, we have no answer to this petition. The Ho-Chunk were forcibly expelled from Minnesota during the aftermath of the U.S.-Dakota War of 1862, despite the fact that they did not participate in that conflict. On a personal level, I feel some sense of potential resolution now that we've come to a moment when records and stories like this are receiving wider attention. For those who may not be familiar with the history of Indian boarding schools, and admittedly many of us were never taught this history, the Indian boarding school system was a system of assimilative education targeted at Indigenous children for over 150 years, devised as a method of eradicating what was called the, quote, Indian problem, the idea that Indigenous identity itself was an obstacle to U.S. expansion, particularly with regard to land. Wars were risky and costly, and assimilation of Indian children was frankly promoted as a cheaper alternative to killing them. The school system was maintained under the U.S. federal government with collaboration from various Christian denominations, including the Catholic Church. Attendance by all Native children in ages from 6 to 21 was mandatory by law, and Congress authorized severe penalties for parents who resisted, including imprisonment and threats of starvation. At the schools, children were stripped of personal and cultural identity, such as clothing, the cutting of their hair, which for many tribes is only done as a sign of intense grief or shame. Their names were changed, sometimes only to a number, and they were widely forbidden from speaking their own languages. Schools that were located off of reservations were considered more effective at severing familial and cultural ties by physically separating children from their communities, sometimes by distances of hundreds of miles. Their education focused almost exclusively on labor, with children loaned out to work neighboring farms and as domestic servants. Conditions across the system were fraught with overcrowding, disease, malnourishment, and incidents of abuse. The children were often not permitted to return home to their families, some even in death. I think it's important to note that this wasn't just the way things were back then. Concerns about the schools were raised on countless occasions since the very beginning of the program, including in a sweeping expose in 1890 and in 2 major government-sponsored investigations in 1928 and again in 1969, which unequivocally declared the system a national tragedy. However, the ongoing pain wrought by the system and its far-reaching ramifications continued unaddressed, and Native American parents were not granted the legal right to refuse placement of their children in schools in this country until 1978. There are many living survivors of this system, and the intergenerational trauma that it caused ripples through descendants today in disparities in health, economic status, education, and continuing discrimination, not to mention a violent suppression of culture countered only by extraordinary resilience. We are challenged then to grapple with the church's cooperation in the system, which was so devastating by design. The history is complicated, and it's difficult to reconcile the narrative of good intentions of missionaries with often horrific personal accounts from survivors and descendants. The church is called to resist the urge to take a defensive stance and instead to truly listen, to acknowledge that priests and sisters and brothers and staff had vastly different experiences of the schools than the students and their families, to recognize the very real harm that was done in Native communities by the participation of Catholic institutions and individuals. When the news broke in the summer of 2021 about hundreds of child burials on Indigenous residential school grounds in Canada, I knew that I had to prepare to answer some very difficult questions. Although the burials in Canada were widely publicized as discoveries, they've been well known to exist all along in survivor memories and historical records alike. Even in the United States, for example, at Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, which is renowned as one of the earliest and most successful off-reservation boarding schools in this country, repatriation of remains from nearly 200 children's burials have in fact been underway since 2017. What changed is that recent events opened the way for unprecedented national and international awareness, which in turn opens the way for hope. A Métis representative from Alberta, Canada, named Gary Gagnon put it this way: "Hearing the voices of all those children woke up our nations." So efforts to address this painful legacy are underway. The U.S. Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, launched the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative, and with that preliminary report released this last May, we now have for the first time an official list of these schools. The list was compiled through a remarkable partnership between the very government office that oversaw these schools historically and an Indigenous-led nonprofit based here in Minneapolis, the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, or NABS. According to that official list, Minnesota is among the top 5 states in the nation with the most Indian boarding schools, with 21 that received federal support. Based on our research to date, roughly half of those schools were operated by the Catholic Church here. Interestingly, the Catholic Church in Minnesota was actually the first in the nation in 1975 to issue a statement acknowledging the injustices against American Indians, and we have the opportunity again to lead positive efforts in this area. My colleagues in Catholic archives around the country have been preparing to play a critical role in addressing this legacy by trying to answer, among others, that most pressing question: what happened to the children who never made it home? In some cases, depressingly few records remain in our archives, but the communities most affected by these tragedies have historically had no access to relevant records, so the slightest detail might mean the world to families who only want to know what happened. To give a concrete example, many children who were taken to the boarding schools spent their lives believing their families had abandoned them because that was all that they knew. But we have notations in our records in this archdiocese proving otherwise. We have in the archives a small scrap of paper with a boy's name and the note, "Parents want him badly." Those 4 words could heal a lifetime of misunderstanding and grief. It is both humbling and a privilege to assist with the project of making this information available to those to whom it matters the most. This moment we find ourselves in is a critical opportunity for deeply meaningful healing, not only for Indigenous communities, but also within the Church itself. I strongly believe that our well-being depends on the well-being of others, and acknowledgement and healing are not simply the burden of those who were harmed. The work of healing is for all of us as we grapple together with the colonial legacy. Pope Francis's statement of apology issued in April highlights this and sets the tone for the path ahead. I have to acknowledge also that there are strong parallels between this work of examining the Indian boarding schools and the clergy sex abuse crisis. It's hard to face another reckoning. It's exhausting emotional work, but all the more important because of it. It is in the stated core values of the Society of American Archivists that our work creates a mechanism to cultivate transparency within organizations that can help make power imbalances visible, and that we are called to support those whose voices have been underrepresented or marginalized to constantly work toward creating anti-oppressive environments. We are custodians of stories, including very painful stories, and that is sacred work. Centuries of harm and erasure are not undone overnight, so this is going to be a long process of healing. And we are still very much in the truth phase, simply trying to understand what took place, and there's so much more yet to learn and understand. The process cannot be rushed, and it is critical that any initiatives are centered on Native needs and personal relationships and led by Native voices, or we risk perpetuating the harm of Indigenous erasure and disempowerment. And I heard this put very neatly by Kylan Jacobs of the Osage Nation as nothing about us without us. The opportunities that I've had to listen to, connect with, and collaborate with tribal historic preservation officers and other Indigenous leaders have been for me the most hope-inspiring aspects of this work. Just this Friday, September 30th, was the National Day of Remembrance for Indian boarding schools. I spent several hours over Friday night tending a watchfire at Gichitwa-Kateri Parish, just north of here, sitting in prayer and meditation with others. And there I received the gift of listening to local community members, as well as Macaw Black Elk, himself a Catholic educator at a former Indian boarding school in South Dakota and renowned leader in efforts for truth and healing. Yesterday morning, we walked from the Basilica to Cristo Rey High School, carrying our prayers in pilgrimage and solidarity. I'm still processing that experience, but it has reinforced my sense of hope in the possible outcomes from this work. My primary hope is that by sharing what we know and listening to one another as we all grapple with healing from this very painful shared legacy, our communities can be led by a spirit of understanding and compassion. My challenge to myself, as well as to each of you, is to consider how all of us are affected every day by the colonial legacy and called to heal, to consider how we can walk together in that healing, to not shy away from or try to justify the mistakes of the past and the present, but to strive for truth and openness. Thank you very much for your time and attention.